Hi, Chris. Welcome to Design Rendezvous. And I'm so excited that you're here to talk about one of my most favorite topics, which is brands. And the common denominator being that we both teach at respective universities. That's really interesting. And I want to dive straight into my first question. And there's so much to unpack, right? But the first thing I want to talk about is I know how passionate you are about creating purposeful brands, right? But more than I think ever, I have been wondering as to why it's become an imperative now. Because brands have been around for a while. I know the world of branding has changed, but I think the purpose and the push towards them having a purpose has been exponential, right? Because there were brands that didn't have purpose and they were doing, very, very well. But why is it that purpose is so important now?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on Design Rendezvous. Fantastic to be here with you. And I think the first thing is your question is timely to ask, because I think around the world today, we're looking for leadership, and purpose really helps us navigate complexities and uncertainties. So I think the world is crying out for leadership. And perhaps also they're crying out for a different type of leadership. And that is often now coming from our sources of trust, which are brands, whether that's companies, products and services, or indeed non-governmental organizations and charities, philanthropies. So it's coming from organizations that really have a deep emotional bond with consumers and communities, which is why branding is so important. So I think that's the first thing I would say, is that purpose is even more important today because of this search for leadership and guidance. The second thing I would say, which goes to the second heart of your question, and I think one that's really important perhaps for those watching and listening today, which is the role of brand has changed in our lives. And the role of brand has changed for various reasons, but I think the most important ones, which again connect to purpose, is that we're seeking social relationships and connections that go beyond just companies making money and going just beyond buying a commodity product. We're looking for more meaningful exchanges of value, obviously quality in products and services, but the ability of technology to disrupt our lives and to cross borders and through TikTok and Instagram bring us new ideas, new connections outside of our homes and in the environments where we live, means that we're living in a global, local world today, and navigating choices and understanding that we have choices is super important. And that is what brands have always done. They've been a guarantee of quality and identity and trust and all of that, but they've also connected us to each other and like-minded people and more meaningful experiences. So I think that's the reason what's changed now, particularly with a younger generation, which means brands have to be a little different than perhaps what they were for parents and grandparents.
It's interesting that you mentioned about the role of brands, right? And I think, I cannot help but talk about what the pandemic has done to us and the choices that has changed. Fundamentally, right from, FMCG to, fashion to tech, name it. And we're looking for meaning in all of these brands, right? Like I'm looking for meaning in Chobani, I'm looking for meaning in, ChatGPT. Like, look, this is the spectrum. And what's interesting is that while by our I mean the people's ask from brands have evolved, I want to understand why has it exponentially increased after the pandemic, right? Like what are the things that have changed? What are people looking for all of a sudden that perhaps it wasn't as surfaced, it was latent? But now it's it's everywhere.
Well, I think the greatest thing that the pandemic around the world shifted was our social culture and expectations of business and society. So it coincided with, let's say, a fundamental distrust in some cases with both media and media sources and truth. That was one thing. Perhaps there was also a distrust on all the things that we thought and those institutions that we thought would protect us. including government, for example. And governments, therefore, fell by the wayside in failing to meet the requirements of their constituents, which is clear, consistent advice, meaningful, truthful discourse. And indeed, when it comes to personal safety, it goes to prove that people were sort of left on their own, which is a dangerous thing too, because if you're misinformed and you feel that you have no support and no direction, who do you turn to? You turn to your friends and your family. So what came out of the pandemic was this appreciation for our meaning systems and our connections and relationships. That's one thing. So much closer to home, local communities and people that you know and trust. So we became a little more tribal, to be quite honest. And globalism and multinationalism sort of suffered as a result of that. That's one thing. The second thing is because we were forced to go and live in our homes and not go outside of our homes, we relied upon technology, which meant that we were now shifting to what we're doing today, which is a media-driven storytelling connections through the internet, through different channels. We began to open up to different possibilities in an omnichannel world. So again, which does require the ethics of, is this truthful? Is this accurate? Is this a real video or is it a deep fake? But that's a good thing because it forced us to also reappraise the integrity of authenticity and accuracy. So I think the cultural shift around things of integrity, which is honesty, accountability, transparency, combined with what are the brands, organizations, institutions that connect me to others like me and the real facts and data, that sort of converged. And brands are right at the crosshairs of that because they're dependent upon trust, they're dependent upon experience and relationships, and they also have the power to motivate us through amazing curated content and experiences. And that's where, for marketing students or individuals and creatives, is content curation and storytelling and connections became the currency of emotions through COVID. And I think that currency of emotions, which again, media and institutions like government can't really deliver that very well, or if they do, it's sort of a campaign promise, right? Whereas brands have to consistently show up, be accountable, and they can tell better stories. And if you look at our profession, that I think the quality of creative storytelling, emotional connections, experiences, and relevance has completely shifted the game. And that's a good thing too, by the way.
Yeah. That's wonderful because I was at work in the morning, it's night here, and we were talking about how human has any brand become, right? We know that, we need a personality, we have the personification, we have the archetypes, and we have all of those frameworks, right, to kind of humanize the brand. But I think it's wonderful that you mentioned that, the currency of emotions that kind of amplified post-pandemic, because all of us have become more sensitive. All of us want to know more. We want to know the truth. We want to, kind of understand it's coming from the right place. And I feel the more conscious we're getting, it's becoming a challenge for brands to also live up to it, because it's not a challenge, it's just business or competition, but it's a challenge of, hey, these people that were doing just fine maybe like 3 years ago now don't care too much about me, right?
Absolutely. The shift to a human first, people centric, not consumer and customer centric, there's a difference, right? You don't necessarily have to transact and sell to someone to demonstrate empathy and understanding. And I think that's the shift. Before pandemic, I think that profit as the only motive was really very clear and valued by companies, whether small, large, or corporate globals, right? But today, profit can only come as a result of a degree of humanity and being human-centric. So we talk about the human truths, the universal things that we share, the archetypes of how we perceive brands, and the role they play in our lives, and also the expectations we have of products, services, companies, brands, employer, investor, and or consumer bias. And I think what you just touched on is super important, that creativity is the ability to interpret things that either are complex or perhaps have a tension in them, but to engage the mind and the emotions together. That's really the role of good creative thinking applied to business. And brands are perhaps the best at that. But today, after COVID, we crave this connection that's meaningful, authentic, and accountable. We crave the ability to engage as well. During COVID, we became our own personal storytellers and broadcasters. That so many businesses were born out of, the challenges of COVID, where people also redirected their lives with more purpose to things that were meaningful to them, that they were passionate about. They decided to give up the hamster wheel rat race and pursue something else, not just for profit, but for making a meaningful difference. So all of a sudden, you have a huge cadre and cohort of people at all ages, by the way, around the world, who want to do and create businesses, opportunities, storytelling. And again, I think this is the dynamic of this generation, to really look back and say, we're not going to depend upon other people telling me and big institutions. I want to engage and be part of that. Highly personal, highly passionate, highly purposeful.
Yeah. I want to move this conversation to the point that you touched upon earlier about brand ethics and integrity, which is actually stemming, like you said, coming from the people, right? Because it stems from there. They are the source for which the brands need to kind of really live up. And I know you lead that vertical at Interbrand. Talk to us about why this was so important to, from an organization, from an Interbrand perspective, to share this as a service, et cetera, to brands, because we've been in the business for a very, very long time, and even other consultancies can be like, hey, no, we do just fine without talking about brands and ethics. We can talk about positioning and, design and, be done with it, right? And what about this makes it important? And maybe you can illustrate that maybe with an example that's maybe famous.
Sure. Well, branding for so many years and for many people, and you don't have to be a marketing expert to think and understand this, is the outside, how things appear on the outside. It's very externally directed. Integrity and ethics starts from inside individuals, inside companies, organizations, and you can't see someone's ethics, right? That you can't see how they make decisions and how they navigate the world, which is super important to trust. And of course, trust is at the very heart of branding. So it's funny today that, again, post-pandemic, that what our discipline, our practice is trying to say is, before you even get to the outside externalization, you have to really look inside. And as we were just talking, I think the cultural and values shift that's occurred is that new generations and old generations are looking for a return to trustworthy, accountable disclosure and commitments, and they want to see the alignment between what you say and what you do. And they want things to be done right, but they also want companies to do the right thing. So this is where the integrity of consistency and also communications comes in. So again, I think one of the challenges for us in our practicing sense is to connect this with organizations that want to make a difference. And you can look at the top of the chart of the brands that are the most ethical, like a Patagonia, a Ben & Jerry's, that are really founded on principles of sustainability and doing the right thing, all the way through to companies in almost every sector who are basically now saying, you know what, you can trust us, we're a good employer, we're a great member of communities and citizens, and we're looking to actually make a difference through the products we make. So whether that's Unilever or Hindustan Lever in India, whether that's a financial services organization such as Visa or MasterCard, or indeed whether it's a fast-moving consumer good or a pharmaceutical company, you can look across that, and the measures are there, not just with best global brands that we rate every year, from Nike and Microsoft and Apple and all those, Google, those amazing tech companies, all the way through some of those old familiar brands like GE, or some of the companies that are like Boeing, even who went through a crisis. Like, they're looking to pivot away from we just make money and products to now we're actually meaningful members of communities, and we're seeing this across every arena, every sector, from industrial goods companies, and particularly in the energy sector, and that's one that's super challenged right now about ethics, all the way through healthcare, pharmaceutical, and consumer goods.
And it's wonderful, because the more we talk about the different and the evolving facets and disciplines that are emerging within the branding system, right? I want to talk about the education of branding, right? And I know both of us teach at various universities, and I want to touch upon the future of branding, of course. And I feel like if we have to talk about the future, I don't want to talk about just the 5 or 10 years, but, and as much as I know we can't predict the future, it's so unpredictable, like we just discussed. But, what are the value systems? Not skills, because I feel like skills can be taught, and AI is taking over so much. Let's not have that conversation. Right?
Exactly. Human intelligence.
Yes. But I think it's the value systems that will kind of transcend, the generations perhaps, and the different tech that comes in to play within the ecosystem. So what do you think? What are the important values or the things that, students, young creatives really need to cultivate, develop, so that they're not replaceable, so that, they have an opinion, that they are much more grounded in reality and not the pretty that we see?
Great question, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge because I'll start with maybe the thinking before pandemic, and particularly how people saw their future in careers. Because the background assumption and bias that we just talked about was that working for a company and profits were the motivating factors behind careers and career choices, and behaviors to get jobs and be successful were different than they are now. So I suggest that the first thing is, I think profit and the search for a career to make a lot of money, and this idea of career paths that are both linear and they're also very directive through organizations is gone. There's way more free agency, and there's way more abilities of self-starter mentalities, as we talked about, which is this idea of initiative and entrepreneurship. That's one thing, but it has to be tempered with the skill set and the mindset of ethical decision making, which is honesty, transparency, and accountability. So again, I think this is super important because as we talked about the cultural shifts and sensitivity, we value more diverse opinions. We get better solutions and innovative thinking from diversity, and acceptance and inclusion. That's one thing that has certainly shifted away from like what separates and divides us. And we're still in this world where we need to focus on that as people and as humans. I think that recognizing that sustainability, and not just in carbon offset, but like every decision and act you make has a consequence. So you have to be accountable for that, and you have to think about how can the decisions and the actions I take and the impact on the world not do any harm. So I think that's absolutely embedded in the new generations. I think that they realize that you just can't, indiscriminately have supply chains and products and purchasing and consumer behavior without accountability. So I think that's important. And the last thing, and this goes back to this sense of individualism, we really need to focus on collaboration, connectivity. One person cannot have all the answers. And this idea of building bridges and relationships and knowing how to have dialogue and how to listen first before speaking or selling, listen and engage with the idea of hearing and listening for the human truth, the common ground, and then again applying the idea of how you work together to find a solution that works for everyone, the win-win-win, the idea that everyone's included and welcome, and yet you can create real value by thinking this way and not just in the linear, I need to make things, sell things, and then I become more successful. I think, and I being the key word, is that we are greater when we work together and we seek common ground. So I think those are some of the things that at least I try, and I know you do. This is where we get our energy from to share with new generations the skills that are necessary, the learning, and why branding and creativity is right at the core of what the world needs.
Yeah, this is wonderful that you just spoke about, I think, this collective value creating, principle, right? It's this shared journey. And I think it's not just, you and me, but I think so many students, young creatives, even like seasoned, creatives and brand creators, we get in this whole rut of, this is what success is, this is what brand ambition is, this is how it's going to be, I don't care about the other collaborators, right? Like I don't care about my own brand ecosystem, it's fine if my supply chain is not okay, but I need to market well. There's so many angles to it, right? But I think it's wonderful that you mentioned that it's so important to have an ethical bone in you, because the world is going to sway you, right? And there's enough and more.
True.
If you can be your own source of truth and accountability in every action and every decision you take, again, people can't see your ethics and your integrity, but they will understand it from how you make people feel, how you show up. And look, there's two things I tell, and I practice this every day. A very mindful practice as well, which is staying curious and listening to learn. I think that's super important. And the other thing is use technology to your advantage for that and connecting with other people, even people who might have a completely different perspective or view. Because if you practice this, you become more worldly and better informed. It also means that the decisions and the critical thinking you deploy allows you to see things from different perspectives, so that you don't live in a bubble and a swim lane of I'm right, this is the only answer, this is the only solution and path. Again, careers are not linear anymore, solutions are not linear.
It's a journey and we all are in it. Yep.
And isn't it more fun together?
Yeah, more together, right? And that's the whole point. So on that note, I don't think so I can top that at all. But thank you so much, Chris, for being here. This has been fantastic. And we will talk soon, very soon.
Listen, you need to go to sleep.
I'll see you later. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.